Imagine waking up one morning to find strangers pitching tents, lighting campfires, and parking RVs all over your family farm, and when you call the police, they tell you it's not trespassing, it's an HOA public campsite. That's when I decided, if they wanted a campsite, I'd give them one they'd never forget. The first key point of the story revolves around the outrageous claim made by the HOA, and it sets the entire chain of events into motion. Imagine owning a piece of land that has been in your family for generations, a place where your grandfather once toiled under the sun to cultivate crops, where every corner of the soil holds history, sweat, and hard work. To you, that land is not just property, it is legacy, security, and the most tangible reminder of your family's perseverance. Now, imagine standing at your doorstep and hearing a group of officials from the Homeowners Association look you dead in the eye and say, without hesitation, that your farm is no longer yours. Instead, they have decided it will be a public campsite, free for people to use however they please. The sheer audacity of that claim is enough to shake anyone to their core. At first, there's disbelief. How could anyone even think they have the authority to strip away private land and label it as community property? You hold the legal documents, the deed is in your name, and the farm taxes are paid every year from your pocket. Yet, these strangers stand before you, speaking with confidence, as if they had the final say. That's the kind of arrogance HOA boards sometimes carry, a belief that their rules and decisions override common sense, and in this case, even the law itself. For the farmer, it was surreal. He laughed, thinking it was a bad joke, but the stony faces staring back at him made it clear, they were dead serious. The HOA representatives justified their claim with twisted logic. They argued that the land was unused and that, according to their bylaws, unused or neglected property could be converted into a community space for recreational purposes. Never mind the fact that this was an active farm. Never mind that crops had been planted and harvested. To them, it was an opportunity to grab power, to expand their control, and they didn't care who got trampled in the process. They dressed it up with phrases like public good and shared space, but beneath the polished words, it was nothing but a blatant attempt to take what wasn't theirs. For the farmer, it wasn't only about property rights. It was about dignity. Standing there, listening to strangers reduce his family's land to some weekend getaway spot, felt like a personal insult. This was the land where his grandfather had worked with cracked hands and aching bones, the land where he himself had spent countless early mornings and late nights ensuring the crops grew. To have it stripped away with a single declaration felt like a betrayal not just of him but of his entire lineage. And yet, the most shocking part wasn't just their claim, but the confidence with which they delivered it. The HOA acted as though it was already settled, as though his voice and his ownership no longer mattered. That moment was the spark, the insult that pushed everything else into motion. It was the moment the farmer realized that if he didn't fight back, he would lose not only his land but also the respect and memory of everything his family had built. The second key point of the story takes us from the shocking claim of the HOA to the harsh reality of invasion, where the farmer's worst fears come true. At first, the idea that his private land could be turned into a so-called public campsite felt ridiculous, almost laughable. But within a week, the laughter disappeared, replaced by anger and disbelief. One morning, the farmer stepped outside only to find his once quiet and peaceful farmland transformed into something unrecognizable. His crops, which had taken months of careful work to nurture, were now trampled beneath the heavy tires of RVs. The wide-open fields that used to echo with the hum of nature were now crowded with tents, folding chairs, and portable grills. It wasn't just his land anymore, it looked like a festival ground for strangers who had no respect for the space or the sweat that went into maintaining it. The invasion wasn't subtle. It wasn't a couple of campers passing through. It was deliberate, loud, and chaotic. Families he had never met laughed around campfires that were dangerously close to dry grass, children ran through rows of crops as if they were playgrounds, and dogs barked and dug holes in the soil he had carefully tended. The farmer watched in frustration as beer bottles clinked, music blasted from speakers, and smoke from their grills drifted across his property. What had once been a place of hard work and serenity now felt like a carnival he had never invited or approved of. The sense of violation grew deeper by the hour. Every corner of the farm now carried signs of disrespect. Campers left trash scattered across the ground, empty food wrappers fluttering in the wind, plastic cups crushed into the soil. The land that had been a source of pride was being treated as a dumping ground. It was as though the HOA had stripped away not just his rights as an owner but also the dignity of the land itself. Worse still, some of the campers acted like they had every right to be there. They greeted him casually, waving as if he were just another visitor passing through, ignoring the fact that he was the rightful owner. The arrogance stung almost as much as the intrusion. What made it unbearable was the powerlessness he felt. When he tried to confront the campers, some claimed they had been told by the HOA that this was now a designated public space. Others brushed him off entirely, insisting they had paid their fees or had permission to be there. It was clear that the HOA had not only made the claim but had actively encouraged people to move in and take advantage of his farm. The farmer stood there, surrounded by strangers who saw his life's work as nothing more than a cheap vacation spot, and he realized that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a hostile takeover. That invasion was the turning point. It wasn't about paperwork anymore, or legal debates, or HOA bylaws. It became personal. The farmer wasn't just watching his land being used, he was watching it being destroyed, piece by people who neither knew nor cared about its history. Every tent that went up, every crop flattened beneath careless feet, was fuel to the fire building inside him. The invasion was no longer something he could ignore or hope would resolve itself. It was a declaration of war on everything his family had built, and he knew that if he didn't act soon, there would be nothing left to save. The third key point in the story is perhaps the most frustrating of all, the complete failure of the authorities to step in and protect the farmer's rights. After seeing his land invaded, his crops trampled, and his family legacy turned into a chaotic campground, the farmer did what any reasonable person would do. He picked up the phone and called the police. In his mind, the law would see the situation for what it was: trespassing, destruction of property, and outright theft of land. He expected flashing lights, officers ready to issue warnings, and campers being escorted off his land. Instead, what he got was a cold, dismissive answer that made his blood boil even more. When the police finally arrived and he explained everything, the officers exchanged looks with each other, then shrugged. One of them calmly told him, "This seems to be an HOA matter. We can't get involved in disputes between homeowners and their association." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. An HOA matter? How could it possibly be an HOA matter when strangers were sleeping in tents on his land, destroying his crops, and treating his farm like a public park? The farmer pulled out his paperwork, waving the deed and property documents in front of them. Still, the officers were unmoved. They repeated that unless there was physical violence or a direct threat, their hands were tied. It was infuriating. The very people meant to uphold the law were treating him like an outsider in his own home. He wasn't asking for special treatment, he was demanding the most basic protection of his rights. Yet the police acted like his ownership meant nothing, as though the HOA had more authority than the legal documents he had carried in his hands. To make matters worse, some of the campers began watching the exchange, snickering as if they knew the farmer was powerless. That humiliation cut deep. Desperate, the farmer reached out to other officials. He called the city offices, trying to explain the situation. The answer was the same: if the HOA has declared the land for community use, then you'll need to resolve it through them. The very institution that had created the problem was now being positioned as the only solution. It was like being trapped in a nightmare where the thieves not only stole from you but also convinced the authorities that they were the rightful owners. Everywhere he turned, doors slammed in his face. It was as though the system had abandoned him entirely. He began to realize something critical: no one was coming to save him. Not the police, not the city, not the law. As far as they were concerned, his fight wasn't worth the paperwork or the trouble. The HOA had spun their story well enough to convince everyone that they had some kind of authority over his land. That realization lit a different kind of fire inside him. Up until that point, the farmer had hoped someone would step in and set things right. But with each rejection, with each dismissive shrug from an officer or city clerk, his hope shifted into resolve. If no one else was going to protect his land, then he would. If the system refused to see the injustice, then he would take matters into his own hands. The betrayal of the authorities didn't just deepen his frustration, it gave him the clarity he needed. He was alone in this fight, but he wasn't helpless. That moment of abandonment became the catalyst for what came next. The farmer realized that rules, officials, and paperwork wouldn't save his farm. Action would. Direct, decisive, undeniable action. And that's when the idea for revenge started forming, an idea so outrageous and so unforgettable that the HOA and its campers would never dare cross him again. He wasn't a violent man. He'd spent his life coaxing life out of soil, not thinking in terms of sabotage. But after the police shrugged and the HOA moved in like squatters, something in him snapped into a focused, cold clarity. There was no courtroom victory coming anytime soon. The law had been slow, and the HOA had already put boots on his fields. If he was going to protect what his family had built, he would have to be the architect of his own solution and make it so painfully effective that no one would ever test him again. Behind the barn sat relics of another era, rusting farm equipment, a half-buried septic tank the previous owners had abandoned, old corrugated pipes that led under the property and out toward a drainage ditch. To a neighbor it would look like junk. To him it looked like infrastructure, and infrastructure can be redirected. For nights he walked the perimeter in the dark, tracing the pipes with a flashlight, imagining routes and choke points. He sketched a crude map on cardboard, where the campers clustered, how the wind usually blew, where the lowest ground lay. This was not a spur-of-the-moment prank, it was a plan that required timing, patience, and a willingness to get his hands dirty. He thought about the moral line he was crossing. Revenge is not justice, he told himself, it was deterrence. He wanted them off his land and he wanted them to remember why you don't trample someone else's life. That thought hardened into resolve. If the law would not protect him, he would create consequences that could not be ignored. He would make the public campsite an experience so miserable, so hazardous, that the HOA would be forced to extract their followers and never return. Practicalities took over. He didn't want to endanger anyone's life, he made sure of that, but humiliation and disgust were fair game. He cleaned the access points to the old tank, cleared silt from the pipes, and fashioned valves and extensions from scraps in the shed. He found a generator, wrapped hoses, and tested flow rates at odd hours so no one would notice. Every step was calculated: where to place the outlet so the waste washed through the tents and not through the farmhouse, how to time it for when the most campers were gathered around the fires, how to ensure the sewage pooled around their chairs and grills rather than trickling harmlessly into a ditch. The night before he acted, he barely slept. He pictured faces he respected, his grandfather's, his daughter's, and the shame he would carry if this backfired. But he also pictured the people who'd burned his fields, the mothers who let their kids run through rows of seedlings, the HOA official's smug smile. That image steeled him. At 3 a.m., when the campsite was silent and the moon was a sliver, he moved. He crawled under fences, carried the hoses like a soldier carrying supplies, and connected the improvised system. He double-checked seals, cranked the generator, and waited. There's a peculiar tension in moments like that, the hush of pre-dawn, the faint crackle of distant radios, the smell of wet earth. He stood in the dark, heart hammering, and flipped the final valve. For a breathless second nothing happened, then a low, wet gurgle answered, and the long, ugly stream began to snake through the campsite. It was not a theatrical explosion, it was methodical, inevitable, and devastating. The plan was not just about humiliation, it was a line in the sand. He'd reclaimed his farm in the only language the HOA appeared to understand. The aftermath was immediate, ugly, and final. By dawn the campsite looked like something out of an apocalypse film, abandoned chairs sinking into mud, smudged footprints leading away from overturned coolers, a string of forlorn lanterns swinging in the breeze. The people who had laughed and blared music the night before fled in such a hurry they left behind half-cooked food and a toppled folding table. The HOA organizers, suit-clad and red-faced, arrived soon after, expecting to restore order and claim victory. Instead they found their supporters soaked, humiliated, and outraged in a way that was entirely self-directed. Nobody wanted to be the one who had booked the community weekend that turned into a disaster. For the farmer, the roar of triumph he'd imagined never came. There was relief, yes, an enormous, animal relief, but it was mixed with the slow weight of what had been done. The campers were not villains in the narrative. Many were ordinary people who'd been told a story and went along with it. A few faces he recognized in the crowd later were apologies in person and angry phone calls the next day from people who felt foolish for believing the HOA. The organizers, on the other hand, had to swallow public embarrassment and the sudden recognition that their authority had been blatantly undermined. The HOA's power was built on perceived legitimacy. Once that was gone, so was much of their influence. Legal aftershocks followed. The farmer invited his lawyer to walk the property with him and to present the official deed and records that showed unequivocal ownership. When the paperwork was laid out, the HOA's bravado deflated quickly. They attempted to spin the narrative, blaming miscommunication, clerical mistakes, or overzealous volunteers, but the simple, undeniable facts remained: this land was private, and the trespass had been orchestrated under false pretenses. Faced with legal clarity and the public relations mess they had created, the HOA quietly extracted themselves from the dispute and stopped sending notices. The campers, embarrassed and chastened, did not return. But victory never felt clean. The fields needed work, repairing ruts from vehicles, replanting trampled seedbeds, hauling away the leftover trash, none of which money could instantly fix. The farmer and his family spent several long days cleaning, repairing, and talking quietly about how close they'd come to losing not just the land but the legacy. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch and listened to the night sounds of the farm return: frogs in the ditch, the low hum of insects, the distant bark of a dog. Those ordinary sounds felt like a benediction. The farm was theirs again, but altered in a way that would linger in memory. There was also an unexpected, subtler lesson. The farmer realized that ownership is not solely a stack of paper, it's a relationship with the community, with neighbors, and with the institutions that claim to protect you. He understood that complacency would be costly. From that point on, he became more engaged. Attending town meetings, building clearer lines of communication with local officials, and documenting everything. He didn't want a repeat, and he didn't want anyone else to be surprised the way he had been. Perhaps the truest consequence was reputational. The HOA's attempt to seize control left them diminished. People in the town who'd been on the fence about its authority began asking questions. The farmer's story, told plainly at a barbecue, repeated in hushed tones at the feed store, became a cautionary tale about overreach and about why communities must respect property and process. In the end, what had started as a fight to reclaim acreage turned into a deeper, quieter victory: the restoration of stewardship. The fields were tangible again, tilled, replanted, and watched over, and the farmer walked them each morning with a new vigilance. He had defended his land, yes, but he had also reclaimed the narrative of what that land meant. Not a commodity to be commandeered, but a living piece of family history that deserved respect.